Germany's strategic ambitions and the unique status her armed forces enjoyed within society helped ensure that, until 1916 at least, the Imperial German Army would be the elite of the First World War. Conscription, the bedrock of the German military system, permitted her to increase the size of her army swiftly, from a peacetime strength of around 840,000 to more than 4 million trained soldiers when war was declared. Able-bodied young German males first joined the Landsturm at the age of 17. At the age of 20, they were called to the colors for full-time military training, which lasted 2 or 3 years, depending upon their arm of service. Thereafter, they would pass into the reserve for 4 or 5 years, and then carry out additional spells of service with the Landwehr and Landsturm until they reached 45. This system, especially the employment of reservists, was to give the Germans a significant advantage over the French army in some critical sectors along the front in the opening weeks of the war. In the summer of 1914, German infantry training was in the midst of a transition from close order to open order tactics, a factor that would cost the infantry dearly. However, the army as a whole was excellently trained, had a solid nucleus of highly capable non-commissioned officers, and could claim a clear superiority in its light, medium, and heavy howitzer weapons, which would quickly prove their worth in the operation to come. The French military system was likewise based upon conscription. In 1913, compulsory service had been extended to 3 years with the colors, then 14 in the reserve. Because her population was smaller, France had to call up a bigger proportion of the nation's men, including colonial recruits, to attain even a semblance of parity with Germany. At the outbreak of war, France was able to muster approximately 3,680,000 trained soldiers, but had fewer reserve formations than the Germans mobilized. In the wake of the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War, French military doctrine had been recast. The most important figure in this process was Lieutenant Colonel Ferdinand Foch. His teaching as commandant of the École Supérieure de Guerre placed the will to conquer firmly at the core of the French army's creed, and inspired an almost mystical faith in the primacy of the attack to the limit. The same gospel was preached by one of Foch's disciples, Colonel Louis de Grandmaison, who, between 1908 and 1911, headed the War Ministry's important operations branch. It was reflected, too, in the Army's superb quick-firing 75mm field gun, which more than matched its German 77mm equivalent, although medium and heavy artillery were given a lower priority. General Joseph Joffre, the chief of the French general and the commander-in-chief designate in the event of hostilities, accorded relatively little weight to a possible British contribution when drawing up Plan 17, the combined Allies' war plan. Traditionally shielded from invasion by the Royal Navy, Britain still had a small, long-service professional army, raised by voluntary enlistment and regarded as sufficient to police and garrison her worldwide empire. 5 separate compulsory service bills had been placed before Parliament between 1908 and 1914, but all had been defeated. The underlying problem was that, in peacetime, no political party was prepared to risk the wrath of the taxpayers or commit electoral suicide by shedding the voluntary system and supporting a financially costly expansion of the Army.
First off, the Canadian Army was an entirely volunteer army. There was no draft or conscripts, so you end up getting a little bit more of a motivated individual.
The principal offensive component of the Army was the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, of 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, numbering approximately 120,000. Behind this were the Saturday afternoon soldiers of the territorial forces formed from the old volunteer force in 1908. Some 269,000 strong in July 1914, the territorial force had been created chiefly for home defense, but could provide a framework for future Army expansion if necessary. Both the regular Army and the territorial force were below establishment strength in 1914 and lacked heavy artillery. However, individually, the men of the BEF were better trained than any of their European counterparts and had unrivaled standards of marksmanship, with many infantrymen capable of firing 15 aimed rounds per minute.
In addition to just the normal Lee Enfield rifles and rifle grenade setups, they had Lewis gun sections and teams. We had support not directly from the Black Watch, but assigned to us were Vickers teams, which were mostly Canadian units. There were some Colt potato diggers that were used early on in the war, but as Lewis guns became more prevalent, that became the squad automatic weapon, with the Vickers being the heavy weapon.
No agreement existed which irreversibly bound the BEF to fight on the European mainland if war came. However, Anglo-French staff talks since 1906 made this possible. The British experience in the first half of the coming war would be all the more painful because the country was permitted to enter a major conflict without any blueprint for military or industrial expansion or any clear idea of the scale of effort that the coming war might require.